Okay, thank you all for tuning in to Convos con Cathy. This is a people power campaign solely funded and powered by working class people like you and me. This is important because while other politicians are taking funds from real estate developers and police unions and will be beholden to them if they win, we will only be beholden to working class people like you and me. All funds that are given will be used to help us disseminate our platform with pamphlets, flyers, merch, and promotions online and in newspapers. Please consider donating now by clicking the link in our bio. All right, thank you all for joining us. Today we have a guest speaker, Eugene, who is a longtime organizer on community violence issues. You're originally from Washington, D.C., yes?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
originally from Charlottesville, Virginia, but I grew up in DC almost just as much.
That's always a tricky question, especially for New Yorkers. We're like, wait, where are you from? Um, so we're here the day after the mayoral debate, which I was not allowed to go into. We were outside protesting. We were, answering all the mayoral debate questions. For those of you that did not watch our live, we will be putting up clips on our Instagram, Rojas #4 Mayor, and on our Twitter, Rojas, that's at Rojas #4 Mayor 2021. One of the biggest, social issues that are being very much magnified by the corporate media, and is all over the news, is the issue of safety. Ever since Eric Adams decided to win, decided to run, he has not won, decided to run, then and won as a Democratic primary, the all of the attention has become around safety in New York City. And despite the fact that the NYD's police records show an actual decrease of all crimes by 1.7% compared to 2020. We see that Eric Adams continues to call for more and more policing as the only solution to criminality. He wants to end qualified immunity, which shields police officers from any civil lawsuits for criminal activity. He also wants to bring back plainclothes officers, and these plainclothes officers were outlawed in, I believe it was 2020, July 2020, and because they were responsible for the killings of Sahir Basal, Kimani Gray, Eric Garner, and now he wants to bring that back. Now, my take on this is policing, right? First of all, not even going into yet, and not even going into the fact that policing is completely inefficient, right? And there's statistics to show that. There was a 10-year study done on policing, and they showed that they only solved 2% of major crime. But on top of that, what does policing actually do? When we talk about shootings, that it's something that our community is extremely worried about right now. When we're talking about shootings, only two once someone is shot, right, the police come after that person has been shot, then removes that person from the community, right? They're put in jail, then funneled into the system, and we're not going to go into all of the ways that they're marginalized while they're incarcerated, but also when they come out, but they're just removed, right? But the social conditions that created this person, that led this person to shoot someone else, are still there. So then these social conditions are going to breed other individuals that are going to do the same exact thing. So one, we're not preventing shootings with police, right? Because they come after the fact, and we just said that they're bad at solving major crimes. But two, we're not even creating long-term solutions. So policing literally doesn't create short-term or long-term solutions, but it seems to be the only solution that our very uncreative and simple-minded politicians have in 2021 after years and years of movements against police brutality. Talk to us, Eugene, a little bit about some community solutions that you've seen implemented throughout the United States.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, I'm so honored to be here and thank you for having me, Cathy. And Eric Adams has not won yet. So I hope everyone following this recognizes that, check where your precincts are, get out, register to vote, and support this campaign if you care about community violence, because the point you made, I think, is so key. And just one quick thing, murders, which is the biggest thing that's being promoted right now, in terms of the fear campaign from Eric Adams and others, are down 79.3% since 1990. So we're still at historic lows, not just in New York City, but everywhere in this country. Crime of all types is actually at historic lows. So even when you see upticks from, let's say 1 to 2 years ago, we are still, again, at historic lows. So I think we have to talk quite a bit about, when we talk about solutions, also about how we frame the problem. And the problem is so often framed as we're in a massive quote unquote crime emergency and we must act now and we need more cops on the street. And that just isn't the case. And in fact, the sensationalizing of individual situations, individual shootings, many of which are very tragic, plays a very important role, and I think a very pernicious role, in actually derailing conversations about what needs to happen in the short term and in the long term to truly address the root causes of these issues like community violence, as you yourself pointed out. And I think one of the things that we have seen around this country and right here in New York City work extremely effectively is something that is known as violence interruption. Now, violence interruption is really exactly what it sounds, right? And it operates on a theory that is certainly correct, and we'll get to some of the numbers here, that many shootings, the majority of shootings and murders, are really things that are almost, they're very rare that there's some major, huge planned plot by some, professional hitman. They're very deeply rooted in the context, the immediate context of situations and conflicts between people and communities, and thus can be mediated in ways that are right there on the spot and are very effective. So the concept of violent interruption is you take credible messengers, who oftentimes are individuals who have been involved in certain community issues, in certain Black market issues, who are known in their neighborhood as people who have, perhaps and sometimes in many cases and in many places around the country, even served time in prison, in jail for some of these issues. So they have credibility. People know that they're not only from the neighborhood, but they're people who have been there and done that, so that what they say carries a lot of weight in terms of what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and how you should view the consequences. So you take credible messengers, and they essentially are acting as community workers, and they're out in the community, they're talking to people, they're making connections, and you call them when something's happening, or sometimes they just happen upon things that are happening. So it can be both ways. You're just out in the community. Sometimes you just are there when things are happening, and that in and of itself is important, or you're a resource that people can call on when it seems like something may go down. Those credible messengers go right to the point of the issue and try to mediate and to de-escalate and to stop people from carrying out a shooting, and hopefully, if they're carrying out no shootings, also making sure that no one is injured and certainly that no one is killed. And people, I think, a lot of times hear this and say, well, how effective could that possibly be? And again, it goes to the propaganda that is put out about the effectiveness of police, which you've already spoken to. But let's just talk about right here in New York City. Violence interruption programs have been mapped and have been studied by the most august bodies here in New York City in terms of higher education. And you look in the South Bronx, the Cure Violence program, where they had a 63% reduction in shootings in the South Bronx. You look at East New York, where they had a 50% reduction in gun injuries. And this is really what we have seen with violence interruption all around the country. And this is without anything additionally other than just credible messengers going out and mediating disputes. In 1 to 3 year periods, reductions that range from 35% to 70% reductions in shootings and murders in communities across this country, in multiple communities here in New York City, in Baltimore, in Richmond, California, in Chicago, Illinois, in Washington, D.C. I mean, in all the places that we're constantly told are the worst of the worst, filled with people who are incorrigible, who could never change, just having people on the streets mediating, treating them like human beings, not like criminals, not like numbers, has been able to have big effects. And here's the other important part, is what studies have shown us about violence interruption is it has a like an ink blot effect, that even in communities that don't directly have the community workers, the more work they do in one neighborhood, they start to see a peace effect, sort of ink blot out, if you will, into surrounding neighborhoods. And why is that? Now, the research shows that the real reason is because people who are engaged in activity that oftentimes can be counterproductive, they're still human beings. And many times they are community leaders. And we don't like to think them as community leaders. We like to demonize them, young people of color, young Black and Latino people, as criminals, as thugs, as all these different things. But oftentimes they're influential with their peers. And when they say, hey, I'm going to put down the gun, I'm going to move on from that, it affects other people who say, well, hey, if that guy who, I knew to be tough and out here and doing his thing is saying we got to go in a different direction, maybe we should go in a different direction.
Right.
Well, it just shows by treating people, young people especially, who are, by the way, young people, Black people especially, are not only the most likely to shoot, but to be shot. So we have to recognize that those who are the most demonized are also those who are the victims, by and large, of what's taking place, yet their voice is the most excluded from the conversation because they're considered quote unquote thugs. But when we treat people as human beings, when we recognize the role they play as leaders amongst their peers, just having community outreach workers mediating disputes on the street can have huge impacts as it concerns shootings and as it concerns gun injuries. And that doesn't even speak to all the different things that we can do to change the conditions that you spoke to.
Right. And we also have to look at, those numbers that you gave are so impressive. 63% reduction in gun shootings, 50% reduction in gun injuries in Brooklyn. And then we talk about the funding, right? How much funding, how little funding these organizations are receiving to do the work that they're doing. And they're showing to be more efficient than the NYPD with close to an $11 billion budget. So imagine, and a lot of people say, well, social workers, that violence intervention program, it doesn't work. How is that going to work? It doesn't work. I've never seen it work. And it's like, of course you've never seen it work. They've never allowed you to see it work. Literally, the number of violence intervention programs are so minimal in our communities. And, it really, so when we're saying we want to reallocate funds from the NYPD, it's because we want to fund programs like these, but also fund other programs like housing, right? So I just want to read off just a little bit. For every dollar that goes into the NYPD, only 29 cents goes to homeless services in New York. 25 cents goes to the Department of Health. 19 cents go to housing preservation, 12 cents goes to youth and community development, and 1 cent goes to workforce investment. And we know that when people when they don't have to eat, they will go find a way to eat, and I think that what's missing from this conversation of the uptick in crime that happened in 2020 is the fact that our communities were neglected like we've never seen before. I felt like I was living in hell. I couldn't even sleep because the ambulances wouldn't let me sleep. We have 11 hospitals for a city of 11 public hospitals, for a city of close to 9 million people. So people were going to those public hospitals because, the New York Health and Hospitals, they take people regardless of the documentation status. The community that I live in is a highly immigrant community that may not have access to healthcare, but we had people dying in the waiting room. That's not a coincidence. That wasn't COVID. That was the fact that our communities aren't funded. We had people that couldn't quarantine, right? And that wasn't COVID. That was the fact that housing is inaccessible, that the cost of housing is completely inaccessible. So when we think about this bloated budget of the NYPD, we have to think about how it impacts every single aspect of our lives. Because while the NYPD has $11 billion, de Blasio cut the New York City Department of Education budget by $170 million. So, when we think about this, and then really we have to think about how do cutting all, housing, education, mental health services, hospitals, how does that impact criminality, right? Because we know that when people don't have anything to look forward to, we begin to see a spike in mental illness, but also a spike in substance abuse. 3 out of every 5 people in Rikers have substance abuse issues. Rikers Island is the biggest psychiatric facility in New York City. It has the most amount of people suffering from mental illness than any other psychiatric hospital in New York City. you know? So
Mhm.
really what we're doing is criminalizing the poor. We're criminalizing people that don't have access to mental health services, that don't have access to rehab when they need it, that don't have access to housing. So they, they have to look for places to make ends meet, and let's be honest. Let's be 100% honest.
Okay.
Sometimes when I talk to my students, they ask me, Miss, how much do you get paid? And I let them know, and I'm like, yeah, this is how much. They're like, what? You work all of this? You went to school? You got a master's degree? You have student loans to
Mhm.
get that amount of money? They're like, I will sell drugs before. And the thing is that that's what happens. Our communities are not offered any other option for for empowerment financially, or the amount of financial resources that they need to live a dignified life, unless they become rappers, basketball players, or some type of sports players, or drug dealers. We're
Mhm.
not given any other option because they make it so hard for us. They make it so hard for our youth. I mean, it's just
No, you're right.
ridiculous.
You're right, and I appreciate that, and I think that's why it's so important what the Rojas for Mayor campaign is doing by bringing this to the forefront. I mean, as you said, you are a public school teacher, and we underestimate the unbelievable trauma that is faced by our youth. We criminalize our young people who are brought up in circumstances, and you just laid it out, so I don't need to go that deep into it, but in circumstances that are just unbelievable in many ways. I mean, food insecurity, housing insecurity, actually being homeless, actually being starving, and on a regular basis. I mean, I think people put a very not people, many people know, but I think a lot of people, especially when we have this conversation about community violence, don't think about the fact that these young people are experiencing all of this. And as young people who don't have as much agency for many different reasons, are oftentimes essentially trapped in a situation that there's just accumulated trauma being put on top of them, the accumulated trauma of all those who are around them, who are being subject to these terrible conditions, the anxiety, the depression, the lack of access to actual mental health treatment, and other circumstances that could accumulate. And then we wonder why violence actually happens. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges, is to move away from the framework of demonization and to move towards a humanization of our young people who, yes, many of them are making choices we'd rather them not make. Many of them are being victimized by others because of those choices. But that doesn't mean that they are some incorrigible, horrible thing that just needs to be swept into a cage and locked up for as long as possible. But we have to address this trauma if we want to address the root of violence. And that trauma is deeply rooted to the social instability of people's surroundings that can't not. I mean, they saw in Chicago a similar issue where they added guidance counselors to some of the high schools where there were the most murders, and they saw a tremendous drop in retaliatory murders. And I think that's a really notable factor, because ultimately, and Politico did a great article about this. I rarely praise Politico, but I will. And what the guidance counselors and others were talking is just having someone to go talk to when a friend was murdered changed everything. Because without someone to talk to who's a professional, you're angry, you're hurt. This is your friend, they were killed, and someone did it, and you might know who they are, and you're lashing out, you're angry, you're acting. But just to say, this is how I'm feeling, and to have someone accept that and to give you other coping mechanisms had a huge impact. The numbers are not on top of my head, but people can go look it up. And I think just that fact alone, that adding guidance counselors to a school was reducing retaliatory murders, shows how poorly served our young people are by these systems, like giving $11 billion to the NYPD. Does every school in New York City have a guidance counselor or a mental health professional that's on call at all times that can serve all students? I don't know, but I doubt it. And I don't know of any school system in the country that does have anything like that, at least not the ones where people are being subject to these sorts of conditions. And I really just think the dehumanization of our young people is one of the things I appreciate the most about what you're doing and running for mayor and being a public school teacher, is to be able to lift up the voices of these folks, these young people who are not given any agency, who don't have the right to vote, who are excluded from the conversations by Eric Adams and others. And listen, Eric Adams is not in the demographic of people most likely to be shot. The people who you see gather around him, who are saying, yeah, we need more police, they are by and large not in the demographic of people who are most likely to be shot. The people most likely to be shot and most likely to be killed are the people we hear from the least. Those are your students. Those are the young people whose voices you're lifting up in this campaign. And I think it's crucial that we move away from this criminalization towards a humanization. And that's what violence interruption is really all about, is that we don't treat people like numbers. We don't treat them like thugs and criminals. We treat them as human beings. We treat them as community leaders amongst their peers. We mediate with them. We talk to them, and we offer them opportunities, solutions, and assistance in addressing the problems that they're facing.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, a lot of times when they talk about the need for more police, they say that people who are most impacted, they're like, oh, go into communities who are most impacted, and they'll tell you we need more police. Well, one, I feel like they uplift the voices of that one or two,
yes,
generally, you know, that believe that. But on top of that, they're not given any other option. Like literally, there is no type of creative solution to like criminality other than policing, even though it has historically shown not to work, right? At reducing crime. And you know, a few, I think it was August in Corona, Queens, we had, which is also where I teach. There was, I think it was 9 to 10 people that were shot in Corona. And we went out and we spoke to the community. And we were like, oh, you know, do you guys think you need more police? We explained violence intervention programs. And you know what they said? They were like, when the police come, they stand on one corner, and whoever was on that corner stands on another corner. And when they go to that corner, they stand on another corner, and nothing gets solved because they're not there. They're really there to get their paycheck. I mean, and then we could talk about the demographics of the NYPD, about their investment in the community, but that's a whole other conversation. But I put all of that into question, right? But, you know, they're there to get their paycheck, and, you know, they're not even... So they're there, and then they're just doing the bare minimum that they have to do to get their paycheck. They're not trying to resolve any conflict. They're not engaging with the community. They're not mentoring youth, you know? And people say like, oh, well, they have the Explorers program, right? First of all, in New York City high schools, it is extremely hard to have sports programs. Literally, there is no space. We do not have soccer fields, football fields, basketball fields. Many of our schools don't even have gyms. And then the NYPD, with their $11 billion budget, you know, trickles a little bit into little sports programs. But imagine if we could expand the sports programs to ensure that every student, every youth of New York City has access to being part of either a sports team, a kickboxing team, martial arts. I love martial arts. That's what I'm saying. But you know, that they actually have access to these things, and we can do that if we reallocate funds from the NYPD. And you know, a lot of people that say like, well, I like the NYPD, they're not all bad. I'm like, what do you like about them? And that's what they mentioned, the Explorers program. And they're like, we like the community policing because they are out there and it's people we know and they talk to the community. I'm like, okay, so let's take people that we know that are from the community, but let's not make the end goal people getting incarcerated. Let's make the end goal people getting mental health services, people getting housing, people getting jobs, people getting what do you call that? A home ownership training, right? These are things that we can do if we don't have this inflated NYPD budget.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I've heard so many NFL players, NBA players, others speak very eloquently about the only reason I made it out of where I made it out of is I had the opportunity to be a part of a team, or, you know, I had a coach that affected something in my life, and different pieces like that and I think it's really about rebuilding our communities. I mean, you know, we don't talk about the fact that, you know, these are the communities that have been historically for 30 or 40 years, especially in Black communities, hit and destroyed by the neoliberal onslaught that has destroyed social programs, that has destroyed economic opportunity, that has turned social assistance into, you know, such a unbelievable warren of bureaucratic nonsense that even people receiving it aren't getting close to enough. And many of the people eligible for many social assistance programs don't even apply. So people are suffering so greatly that these are the same communities that have been, hyper concentrated even more and more because of gentrification and land that is stolen from them, the defunding of education over the different years from the federal perspective, the defunding of public housing. I mean, we could go on and on and on, and we have to add on top of that the impact of mass incarceration.
Yes.
The majority of people in prison in New York State are coming from 7 or 8 different neighborhoods. 7 or 8 different neighborhoods are sending almost every single person to prison. And we've had whole families multi-generationally completely destroyed, completely torn apart, and all of these different things that have happened and that have really destroyed the fabric of so much of our oppressed communities in the city of New York and really in the country writ large. And when we talk about refunding social programs, that's what we're talking about. Rebuilding the opportunities for young people to be a part of something, to build community in ways that are, whether it be the football team, the basketball team, the band, the orchestra, the drama, the art, whatever it may be, allowing young people to be themselves, to express themselves, to build community. It also helps build community more broadly with those who are around them. I think it's critically important. And I think it's just unbelievable. It's unconscionable that you can spend such huge sums of money on something that is proven not to be very effective, which is policing, and things that have in fact proven to be very effective in improving the lives of people are consistently underfunded day in and day out.
And we have to go further than just reallocating funds from the NYPD, because that's definitely one of the reasons we don't have services in our community. But the other one is New York City is the second wealthiest city in the world. It has 99 billionaires with a collective wealth of 560 billion. If we tax 10% of that, we would have 56 billion. NYCHA repairs, to fully repair NYCHA, we would only need 31 billion. So when we're talking about the NYPD, we need to do that, but we also need to go further, and we need to tax the rich of this city, because for far too long they have done whatever they wanted in this city. They have built condos, luxury housing, luxury offices that they leave vacant, while we are suffering, while we are literally barely making ends meet, while our people are being evicted. And literally all of these conditions that they created is why we had over 30,000 New Yorkers die during COVID-19. Literally because the rich continue to control all of the wealth of New York City. And we're left with nothing. And, at the end of the day, we need to fight back. Whether it's November 2nd and after that, we need to continue to organize, because a lot of times they make us believe that we don't have power. But there's 9 million people in New York City, and there's 99 billionaires in New York City. So we have a lot of power, but we have to unite and be organized. And after November 2nd, regardless of who wins, we have to continue to fight for violence intervention programs. And when Eric Adams, Silva, whoever wins, hopefully me, that way we won't have to fight.
Right. That's the easiest way. Get out and vote on November 2nd.
The easiest way, we won't have a struggle. It'll just be done. And that's with me. But, whoever is there, we have to continue to promote violence intervention programs. We have to continue to make New York City a rent control city. So nobody's paying more than 20% in housing. And we can ensure housing for every single person in New York City. We need to open more public hospitals, health and hospitals that are taking people without insurance, without documentation status, regardless of their legal status. We need to fully fund the MTA. The MTA right now is a tax on the working class. It's really the rich that need us to get to work every day.
That's right.
They need to pay that. And they need to pay that with their taxes. They need to fully fund the MTA. They need to fund its infrastructure, and they need to make it public and free, because it is them that needs us to continue to take the train.
No, I
Um,
think that's 100% true. I mean, the reality is this is the center of the not just corporate America, the corporate world. This is the center of world capitalism, the amount of wealth in New York. There's no reason that everything that you just said that we should be doing couldn't be done with a snap of the finger.
mhm. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Eugene. Thank you all for tuning in to Convos con Cathy. As I said in the beginning, this is a people-powered campaign that is solely funded from small donations like working class people like you and me. All donations will be going to flyers, promotions, merch. So please click the link in our bio now to make your donation. Thank you all so much.